The future is now, bringing you my rest of season rankings position by position. And we started off in the S tier for running backs, and we got a list of guys. We got Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Breece Hall, Bijan, Kenneth Walker, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Kyren Williams. Pretty set in stone for me currently right now. Saquon Barkley, like we said, right now has put up 132 fantasy points. I like his rest of season schedule down the line, averaging 22 fantasy points in full PPR. Absolutely love Saquon here as my RB1. Now, you could have debated Saquon Barkley versus Derrick Henry. I hear you. Right now, Derrick Henry is averaging 22.9 fantasy points in full PPR. It's been an absolute monster here over these last 4 weeks, pretty much since week 3 of the season, where he had 30, 35, 16, 25, 25 fantasy points. Derrick Henry has found his home in this offense. Absolutely love some Derrick Henry here. Like I said, between Breece Hall and Bijan, it's probably a little bit of discussion for the rest of season rankings. Breece Hall, we saw these last 2 weeks, 21 and 26 fantasy points in full PPR. Bijan also really got it going with 25 and 23. So depending on how you have it, I just had Breece ahead of Bijan. So depending on how you view Bijan versus Breece, I understand it. Then we got Kenneth Walker, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Kyren Williams rounding out this tier for me. I like Kenneth Walker rest of the season over a guy like Kyren Williams, but I will say Kyren has averaged more in points per game. So if you wanted to make the argument that you need to push Kyren above Kenneth Walker and or Jahmyr Gibbs, I think that is an argument that you could be making. Now, moving on, like I said, that's the S tier. We'll move on to the A tier, and the A tier for me is a pretty good load of guys here. We got Joe Mixon, we got Alvin Kamara, we got Devon Achane, we got James Cook, Josh Jacobs, Aaron Jones, and then Jonathan Taylor. Starting off with Joe Mixon, we've seen in regards to points per game, when Joe Mixon is fully healthy, dude is an absolute baller with 22 fantasy points per game. The biggest thing has been that injury that kind of has caused him to go down. We could be honestly talking about Joe Mixon in the S tier rest of the season if he is fully healthy, but decided to add him here in the A tier. Then Alvin Kamara is the next guy, which last week had a down week with 8.4 fantasy points, but he's still averaging 20 fantasy points in full PPR. Have to have him here in the A tier. Then Devon Achane, James Cook, Josh Jacobs, kind of all these guys are more volume based. We're assuming that the Miami Dolphins offense really starts to turn it around here coming up because it hasn't been great for Devon recently. Then you got Josh Jacobs, like we were saying. Josh Jacobs has been primarily volume based with his fantasy football production with only 13 fantasy points. I think this offense continues to turn it around. Maybe you could argue that this is a little high for Josh Jacobs in my rest of season rankings. I do have Josh Jacobs here in the A tier. Then we have Aaron Jones next. Like I said, Aaron Jones in this week 7 game had 20 fantasy points, even though he didn't look fully healthy. So I've been averaging 16.6, feel very comfortable with Aaron Jones here. And then Jonathan Taylor rounds out the A tier as a guy who, as much as we don't like Anthony Richardson for the rest of these Colts weapons, I actually like it for Jonathan Taylor because it helps him open up some running lanes. We don't love the touchdowns that get stolen from Jonathan Taylor, but I do like Jonathan Taylor here as he recovers from that injury, coming back here in the A tier. We move on to the B tier, and here in the B tier, we got CMC starting it off of this injury, but we do know that if CMC is even 90% of himself, he should be averaging right around 18 to 20 fantasy points per game, which is going to be enough for CMC to be an absolute league winner. We got Brian Robinson, who right now is the RB6 in overall fantasy points for running backs, been averaging 16.6 fantasy points per game because this Commanders team has been absolutely demolishing. James Conner is here next up on my list. I like the rest of the season schedule. He's been getting a ton of volume. It's been a little bit more hit or miss here recently, but he did have 17 fantasy points in this week 7 game. Tony Pollard is the next guy on this list. Tony Pollard, like we said, also in a very struggling offense. 8.5 fantasy points this last week, even though he dealt with a concussion, but he averaging 14.1 fantasy points per game. I do think he's starting to accelerate into a little bit more production down the line, which I do like. Dave Montgomery next. Dave Montgomery's averaging 16.4 fantasy points. He is dealing with an injury. He did get the big contract, so a lot of exciting stuff here for Dave Montgomery, J.K. Dobbins, and then DeAndre Swift ending the B tier. We move on to the C tier, and here in the C tier, we got a bunch of guys with upside and kind of interesting situations. We got Chase Brown, who's overtaking Zach Moss. You could argue that Chase Brown needs to be going higher up in these rankings. Kareem Hunt's been absolutely balling without Isaiah Pacheco, but at what point does Isaiah Pacheco come back? Because the moment Isaiah Pacheco comes back, that hurts Kareem Hunt's overall value. You got Javonte Williams, who had a massive Thursday Night Football game last week, which propelled him up these rankings. Jordan Mason is the next guy on this list as we're waiting for CMC to return. That's absolutely going to hit and hinder his overall value. We got Ramondre Stevenson, Rico Dowdle, who's kind of been on an upswing here recently, and then Chuba Hubbard, who is averaging 15.3 fantasy points, but we do have a highly drafted rookie coming back into the equation. What is that going to do for Chuba Hubbard? I felt like the C tier was an appropriate level value. We move on to the D tier, and we got guys like a Najee Harris, like a Tank Bigsby, like a Bucky Irving, Tyrone Tracy, Rashad White, Zach Moss, Jonathan Brooks, Nick Chubb, and Travis Etienne. Najee Harris has been on a heater these last 2 weeks and looked really good with Russell Wilson. So I understand if you're going to say to me, Caleb, Najee Harris needs to be higher. We officially have moved Travis Etienne falling way below Tank Bigsby in our rankings. We got Bucky Irving here. Have him decently tight to Rachaad White, but I still prefer Bucky Irving rest of season. Jonathan Brooks, Nick Chubb, Travis Etienne. You guys kind of get the drift. Now, moving on to our overall wide receivers. We started off here in the S tier, and we got CeeDee Lamb falling to our wide receiver spot. We still got Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, CD, AJ Brown, and Malik Neighbors. I feel very good if you have a wide receiver in this tier. Shout out to anybody who got to buy low on Jamar Chase earlier on in the season, but I do feel very comfortable about this tier. Not a lot that I'm looking to change. I think you could maybe argue AJ Brown should be ahead of CeeDee Lamb, Caleb, or even Malik Neighbors should be ahead of CeeDee Lamb. I'm still banking on CeeDee Lamb. We know the talent. We know what is to come, but I do like this S tier. We move on to the A tier, and we got Drake London starting off this tier. Drake London has finally started to live up to that full potential that he showed over the last few seasons, and we just said, hey, get this guy a quarterback, 17.6 fantasy points in full PPR. We love it. Tyreek Hill's been struggling without Tua. We're assuming that with Tua coming back, that's absolutely going to help Tyreek Hill start to continue to get back to where he was earlier on in the season. Terry McLaurin, 14.2 fantasy points per game. We still think it could be better. With Jaden Daniels out, a lot that we need to be looking at with Scary Terry. So I do like Scary Terry. Jaden Reed is the next guy who's been absolutely breaking fantasy football, 15.6 fantasy points in full PPR, but it has been hit or miss with this Green Bay Packers wide receiver core. Is it Romeo Doubs? Is it Christian Watson? Is it Jaden Reed? Like you hear Nico Collins coming off of injury. I think it could be potentially a good buy low opportunity for a guy like Nico Collins as we're waiting for him to return. And then DK Metcalf, 15.1 fantasy points per game, ending it off here in the A tier. We move on to the B tier, and in the B tier, we got Brian Thomas Jr. starting it off. Shout out to these wide receivers that are rookies, Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas, the LSU boys, absolutely dominating fantasy football. Very sad that Marvin Harrison Jr. isn't. But Devontae Adams, next, Devontae Smith, Chris Olave, who we're still projecting with no Rashid Shaheed to be able to take a larger chunk of this offense to get more targets, to get more touchdowns, to get more catches. Stephon Diggs and T. Higgins rounding it out here in the tier. Stephon Diggs has absolutely stepped up into that great role that was left by Nico Collins with 15.6 fantasy points over these last few weeks. It's been great. And then T. Higgins has also been dominating with 16.2 fantasy points per game. You could make the argument that maybe T. Higgins should be going ahead of a guy like Devontae Smith or Chris Olave, but I do have them kind of here in the same tier. If T. Higgins does what he does again this next week, I will be bumping him up in my rankings just so everyone is aware. We move over to the C tier, and in our C tier, we like to look at these guys, and we got Cooper Kupp returning off of injury / is Cooper Kupp going to be traded? Like, that's the big question that's going to happen with Cooper Kupp, because if he gets traded, I think it helps his value even more, depending on where he lands. Especially I hear rumors of like Kansas City could be an interesting spot, even though they just landed DeAndre Hopkins. We got Garrett Wilson, Deontay Johnson, Amari Cooper, Zay Flowers, DJ Moore. I feel very good about these wide receiver twos, especially like an Amari Cooper could potentially give you wide receiver 1 days, or like Zay Flowers, but they're a little bit more inconsistent than the guys that are in the B tier. We move on to the D tier, and this is where, and this part of the season, a lot of it's less more than projection, but a guy like a Debo who is dealing with pneumonia, hopefully he can come back, be healthy, especially with no Brandon Ayuk. I think Debo Samuel could get the bump up, but I don't expect him to play this week. We got Marvin Harrison Jr., who's been on the absolute struggle bus, not being able to connect with Kyler Murray. So we got to be hoping that they can get that connection down. Mike Evans is dealing with probably a 2 to 3 week hamstring injury. Jalen Waddle is getting his quarterback in Tua Tagovailoa back. We got Puka Nacua, who will be returning off injury here over the next 2 to 3 weeks. And then JSN. Like we said, you're mixing a little bit of now value with maybe less upside with guys that should be studs in their own tiers just based on those injuries. We move over to the E tier. And the E tier, like we said, we got Jameson Williams, who is going to be getting a suspension, George Pickens, Tank Dell, Darnell Mooney, Jacoby Myers, Lad McConkey. Feel really good about some of these wide receivers here. You're maybe saying Caleb Tank Dell is still rated way too high. I understand, but he's continuing to get the opportunity. Darnell Mooney kind of had a down week after that amazing week 6 Thursday night football game. George Pickens had himself quite the day. So I do like this tier. Jacoby Myers is the clear one. You can kind of make the case for a lot of these guys in the E tier, but this is currently I have my E tier ranked. We move on to the F tier, and maybe I have DeAndre Hopkins too low. Like I said, guys, this is being recorded right after the DeAndre Hopkins news on Wednesday morning. And I think you could maybe talk to me about DeAndre Hopkins should be put in the E tier, but like I said, he's going to have to compete for targets with Xavier Worthy and with Travis Kelce, but I do think this helps. But there's also the rumors that they're not done, that they're going to be adding another wide receiver in, which those are just rumors. We're looking at the now. I feel very good about this tier. You got high upside guys like a Hopkins, Xavier Worthy. We got Wandell, who it looked good even as a wide receiver too, but his upside's capped with Malik Neighbors back. Jordan Addison, Keon Coleman, Michael Pittman. I do feel very good about this F tier. We move on to the E tier, And in the E tier, we rounded out here with guys like a Khalil Shakir, a Romeo Dubs, a Christian Kirk, a Keenan Allen, a Christian Watson, a Cortland Sutton, and then a Rome Odunze. Got to feel really good about that. We move on here to our quarterback rankings. And in our quarterback rankings, we started off here in the S tier with Lamar, with Josh Allen, with Jaden Daniels, who's dealing with that injury, with Jalen Hurts, Jordan Love, Joe Burrow. The thing that I want to highlight is, of course, shout out to Patrick Mahomes for absolutely destroying a lot of fantasy football teams this year. He has not looked good. Jaden Daniels gets the bump down. He was our QB1 at one point, but we feel pretty confident here saying Lamar Jackson going forward should be the QB1. Jaden Daniels dealing with that injury, put Josh Allen above him, but there's a top three for me between Lamar, Josh Allen, and Jaden Daniels, and then it's kind of everybody else here in the S tier, but I still feel good if I have a Jalen Hurts, Jordan Love, Joe Burrow, but the quarterback landscape has kind of turned ugly here recently, because then when we move on to the A tier, we're talking like CJ Stroud, Brock Purdy, Kyler Murray, Patrick Mahomes, Dak Prescott, and then Geno Smith, where none of these guys are good, but none of these guys have been points per game differences, like compared to like a Jaden Daniels, a Lamar Jackson, or Josh Allen. So I think these guys are in your lineup most weeks, but I will say, I wish, and if you can try to get one of these elite level quarterbacks, I'm 100% doing it just based on how overall rankings are going. We move on to the B tier, and you might say Caleb Williams deserves to be over Patrick Mahomes. I think that's fair. I think the Patrick Mahomes ranking was really due to me banking on DeAndre Hopkins helping this overall passing attack out, but I do like Caleb Williams, Jared Goff. Drake May has made quite the boost up into the B tier in my ranking. Shout out to Drake May, Sam Darnold, Kirk Cousins, and then Anthony Richardson has made the fall down. If you own Anthony Richardson, it's been an absolute terrible, hard year for you. We'll move on to the C tier. We got Baker with no Chris Godwin. We got Aaron Rodgers, who probably pretty good value with Devontae Adams, but it feels like I'm a little bit more worried and concerned about Aaron Rodgers just being able to put up consistent phase football points. Tua coming back. What is that concussion going to look like? Trevor Lawrence, Bo Nix, and then Matty Boy Stafford. Rounding out my quarterback rankings, then we move on to the tight end landscape. The tight end landscape's gross, and I want to tell you guys and apologize to you because I've absolutely sucked at ranking tight ends this year, but I still feel pretty good about this top tier. Brock Bowers, George Kittle, Trey McBride, Travis Kelce. If you got one of these four, congratulations. If you don't, you're probably feeling like I overdrafted a Mark Andrews, I overdrafted a Dalton Schultz. You can maybe even say like Kyle Pitts is starting to turn it on, but we do have Kyle Pitts here in the A tier, but we got Evan Ingram, David Njoku, Jake Ferguson, and then Kyle Pitts. This is probably the end of a tier. Like we said, we got about 8 guys right now that you feel like I got a decent shot, but I still feel like there's a clear tier, like I said, between that S tier and this A tier now. I mean, David Njoku got a crap load of targets. Is that going to continue with Jameis Winston with this terrible team with Deshaun Watson going down? We'll have to see. Like I said, S tier, A tier on tight ends, you feel good, but everybody else right now, you're feeling like yikes. With like even like Tucker Kraft, TJ Hawkinson's going to be coming back. We got Sam Laporta falling all the way down here into the B tier, Cole Kmet, and then Dalton Kincaid. Yeah, Dalton Kincaid has absolutely sucked. So there's no other polite way to say it, but Dalton Kincaid has absolutely sucked for your fantasy football teams. C tier, we did push up Cade Otton, especially with no Chris Godwin. He will be the second receiving option on that team. Mark Andrews has kind of started to reemerge, so there's a chance that Mark Andrews goes screaming up my overall rankings, but I do have Mark Andrews here in the C tier. Hunter Henry, Pat Freiermuth, and then Dallas Goedert rounding out my tight end rankings. So if you like fantasy football, we're going live on Wednesday night at 9 Eastern Standard Time, as well as on Friday night. So if you guys haven't and have a start sit question, let me know down below. If you haven't subscribed because we are growing like crazy on the way to 4,000 subscribers, answering all your questions, helping you win a fantasy football championship. So appreciate you guys for tuning in. Check out these 2 videos if you haven't, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.